So, today we're going to talk about language apps, but before we do that, we're going to talk about cows. I promise there's a connection. So, several years ago, in a state in northeastern India, some NGOs wanted to increase agricultural production. So they decided to replace the local cows, which tended to be lean and poor milk producers, like the one on the left, with plump, high-yielding American ones. And the NGOs, armed with a slew of data and scientific research supporting their claims, were so certain that this would be successful in increasing production that they actually decided to slaughter the local breeding cows and replace them with the American imports. But unfortunately, their data didn't take into account local ecological conditions, weather, and forage crops, which, as it turns out, the American cows weren't suited to. In fact, all of them died, leaving the local community without any cows. So in the end, the people in this community were worse off than they were before. The moral of the story being that a good intention operating on incomplete information can be a pretty dangerous thing. So what does this have to do with languages or apps? Well, as it turns out, this story has a lot in common with how we approach both. Little joke there. So when it comes to language apps, many developers and companies have great intentions. So they want to make learning easier, they want to make it fun, they might even make it free. And in these areas, they have succeeded. So Duolingo, Babbel, Memrise, Mango Languages, just to name a few, are all incredibly fun to use. But there's fun and addictive, and then there's effective. These don't have to be mutually exclusive, and they shouldn't be, as I'm going to argue in this talk, but they are in these cases. Now, why is this? Well, the problem is most of these apps are incredibly inflexible. So they usually pick one method, backed by a handful of scientific studies on learning, many of which haven't been replicated. Bad science. They build features based on 1 to 5 teaching techniques, which never evolved by language level. And then they cram content into those limited spaces, and they do this for every language they teach, regardless of the language they teach. And they certainly never touch upon deep cultural aspects of language, except for the occasional pop-up, which might point you to a quirky little feature of whatever language point you just learned. So what is the result of this? Well, users drop like flies, or cows, as the case may be. I've actually consulted with a lot of these companies, trying to help them improve their curriculum. I'm not going to name names, but some of them only retain 3 to 8% of their users. And if their users don't go away, well, then they're only going to reach upper beginner or pre-intermediate level, which is not really good enough to get a job or actually to function in the language. Or they only use the app occasionally. So I'd like to change all of this. And I'm going to show you how, and it's not as intimidating as it sounds. So let's take a simple and familiar example. So most apps have word order exercises, the theory being that practicing word order is going to help you internalize the structure of the language. So this is good for practicing grammar, and this is true in most cases. But let's consider a language like Russian, where word order is extremely flexible, especially when people are speaking informally. It also depends on what they want to emphasize. So in this case, really simple exercises like this aren't very effective, at least in isolation. And some apps are going to take this into account. So Duolingo, for example, will often include alternatives in a pop-up. Babbel does the same thing. But if you consider our example, which if you counted, there were 6 possibilities of how to translate that very basic sentence. This doesn't make a lot of sense. There are too many alternatives to fit into that tiny little space. Now, what if there was only one alternative? Would this still be a good thing to do? No. Because users aren't going to remember this alternative. Like, they're already having a hard enough time remembering the first translation. You throw another one at them, and then it's like, okay, we move on. move on to the next thing. They're not going to really remember it, and it's probably going to deflate their confidence. So this is like a pretty basic sentence for, someone who's just getting started out in Russian. There's nothing worse than thinking you got something right only to hear, wait, there's more. And you have to consider level. So this is suited to a beginner, as I said, and with beginners, you want them to produce the most common or natural way of saying whatever they're trying to say, but you also want to help them move to the next level. And how do you do that? Well, you pick listening that is slightly above what they're used to. So we have to separate production, speaking, and writing from things like listening. So what is the solution for this problem? Should we just throw this out? No. We can follow it up with dialogues. So the user has to produce one word order, but they're going to hear another. And this is going to help them slowly internalize more colloquial ways or alternative ways of expressing themselves. And it has the added advantage of forcing users to listen early and often, which is the most important skill you can have as a language learner. And we'll see more examples of why moving across skill areas, speaking, listening, reading, and writing, is a good idea in a bit. Now, could we do this for another language, like let's say Chinese? No. Chinese word order is stricter than Russian. So you might say, okay, well then we can kind of use a Duolingo model for something like this. Well, here's the problem. Chinese is really hard. It's really hard. When you first get started, everything is hard. Pronunciation is hard, reading is hard, writing is hard, listening is hard. Okay, so how can we get people to start thinking in Chinese, give them like a softball introduction to the Chinese language, without having all of these other concerns? Well, if we're trying to get them to think in Chinese, a good idea, as counterintuitive as it sounds, assuming they're a native English speaker, is to get them to change an English sentence into Chinese word order. So Chinese word order is who, when, where, what, which is pretty unnatural for like a native English speaker. So we would change a very basic sentence like I eat breakfast at 8:30 to I at 8:30 eat breakfast. I did this like for a month with random English sentences, and then by the end of that, I spent 2 months actually doing this in Chinese. My translation process was so much quicker because of doing this little exercise. I didn't even have to think about changing the English sentence into Chinese word order and then making sure that my pronunciation was perfect and going through all of these steps. And then by the end of the 3 months, I was testing at intermediate level in Chinese. So this would help speed up the process. Now, these small tweaks are great, but they're just the tip of the iceberg. So let's go deeper. If you hear nothing else, hear this. Content drives everything in your app. By content, I mean whatever you are using to teach the language. If you have great content that is activated well, meaning that you are using effective teaching techniques, which we're going to go over in a little bit, everything else will follow. I've noticed that a lot of developers assume that content is just a given, like it just comes out of the clouds or something, or that it's a side issue. So they're like, oh, I'll use natural language processing. I'll pull content from the web. I'll farm it out to some poor soul on Upwork or something like this. But the thing is that content or code makes or breaks your app, and I'm using makes or breaks figuratively in this case. And this is why Russian Accelerator, a web resource that is basically like a keynote with voiceover, can get you up to intermediate level proficiency in Russian, which is a very difficult language, in 3 to 6 months. But Duolingo or Babbel or some of these other apps, which are more technically impressive, more aesthetically pleasing, more fun to use, are not. So the majority of people I've interviewed, taught, and talked to have quit using certain language apps, not because of performance issues, not because of any technical thing, but because the sample sentences seem unnatural, the exercises are boring, they're not getting enough feedback. So content drives everything. And the other thing that I want to mention, and this is another thing that developers have kind of given me a hard time for, is that you actually want to test the app before you code it. And what you're testing for is this actually an effective learning tool? So Kanji Circle, one of my projects, which I'll show you a little bit later, I had to completely change it. And it was great that I had this idea of doing this before I coded it, because I would have had to almost trash everything, because I realized that users were only retaining maybe 20 to 30% of the information, which is terrible. Yeah, so you want to make sure, like, hey, does this actually teach you the language? Okay, so just to give you a little background. So I've been teaching languages around the world for the past 4 years. My first job was in Chongqing, China. I was teaching high schoolers. I had 22 classes, 60 students in a class. Sounds like a nightmare, but it was actually a lot of fun. Most of these kids were going to be studying like in the United States or in Singapore, where most of your classes are going to be like in English. So I had to get them from like barely beginner level proficiency up to like college level proficiency in the matter of 6 months or so. So there was a lot of pressure on me to perform in that situation. Same situation in Prague, only I wasn't teaching teenagers. I was teaching working professionals. I was teaching English and Spanish. And a lot of the people there, you know, they needed this for their job. So like the only thing standing in the way between them and their dream job, or them and their promotion, or them and a significant increase in their salary, was a language problem. Taipei, pretty much the same situation. I was teaching adults, working professionals, had to get them up to a very quick level in a very short period of time. In Taipei, I've been teaching English, Spanish, and Russian. So I'm having to teach languages which aren't my native language and get them up to proficiency very quickly. And now I'm kind of doing a little bit of online teaching, again, for working professionals who have very specific reasons for trying to learn whatever language they're trying to learn. Now, I mention this because a lot of language app developers have no sense of accountability to the people who they're making their app for. When you're sitting in front of a person and you can see their facial expressions, and they're telling you that they're not happy with your teaching, you start to become like really militant about making sure that the techniques that you're using are actually effective. And so you want to develop as if you're going to be presenting this for a real person. And I'm just trying to remind you of that, because a lot of the developers I talk to just, you know, they think it might be cool to develop like a Japanese language app or a Chinese language app, and they just want to put something on their resume. But you have to have a sense of, I don't want to use the word duty, but I think it's a good word, a sense of duty towards the people who you're developing your products for. Because again, this one language could be the difference between them and a promotion, or them and getting a job, or them and improving the lives of their family. Now, what's interesting is that in all of these situations, across culture, across mediums, even if we're talking about like the difference between teaching in a classroom and using language apps, student complaints are always the same about teaching methodology. The first one is kind of a problem. This gets back into our discussion of content. So a lot of students feel like the language doesn't meet their needs. It's like, okay, there's this app and it's teaching me all this language for travel, but I'm not learning Chinese for travel. Like, I'm learning Chinese for business, so I want more business vocabulary. They feel like they're not getting enough feedback, especially with things like pronunciation. It's just telling them if they're wrong. Okay, that's not useful. It doesn't tell you how to improve your pronunciation. In terms of activities, most of them are not looking for vocabulary. They're looking for pronunciation or listening practice. They feel like the practice is repetitive. Again, this is with teachers, both like classroom learning and apps. They feel like they have no guide on how to improve their language skills. They're not learning anything about culture, or they don't feel comfortable asking anything about culture. And they might feel like the experience is impersonal. Now, good teachers are going to do the following techniques. And I'm not going to read through all these because we're actually going to look at examples. Now, the problem with teaching is that teachers are human beings and they are therefore inconsistent. So I feel like if you can do all of the things on this side in your app, very possible, I'm going to show you some examples, you're going to really be meeting user needs, and that's going to also translate into user retention and maybe even some money if you need some extra cash. Because even the best teachers, and I consider myself to be a good teacher, are not going to do all of these things all the time. So the first thing you want to do is take a functional approach to teaching. What does this mean? This means that you're thinking in terms of situations, not individual words and sentences. Now, this seems pretty obvious, but a lot of language apps, they'll start with like a word list, and they're like, okay, I want to get through all of these words, I'm going to build sentences from these words, then I'm going to divide it into topic, then I'm going to divide it into lessons. It's not the best way to do things. Something that's very helpful is using the CEFR. This is great because it gives you actionable steps that you need to take so that you can figure out how to structure your content in a way that is progressing. So let's look at an example. This is Kanji Circle, which I mentioned earlier. This is designed for people who are traveling to Japan. I'm also developing a companion app for people who want to study Japanese in an academic setting. So it's clearly divided into topic. Then it's subdivided into whatever kanji. You can click on the kanji, and you learn it relationally. This over here, this detail view controller, not sure if I like it too much. I've gotten kind of mixed feedback from people, so it might have to change. But it's functional. It gives users what they need. Russian Q&A, this gets you up to full fluency in Russian in about 6 months, 10-minute lessons. It's all question and answer. So that's the first thing you want to do. Second thing you want to do is design content based on extremes. This means that instead of ignoring the slowest student and the best student, you're going to work with them together. And interestingly, a lot of them are suffering from the same problem. So even the best students are going to be kind of sloppy on some details. So the solution with this is that you start with details and you gradually increase in complexity. Now this sounds kind of abstract, so let's look at an example. So if we look at something like this, a very short dialogue, assume that you have one student who understands it, one student who doesn't. All of the vocabulary is taught, so we know that it's not a vocabulary issue. What is the problem? From experience, I can tell you that because there is a huge gap between spoken and written English, that the problem is going to be that they're not hearing did ya? Did you finish the project? I still got to work on it. In American English, we turn T's into D's, and vice versa. So this is a listening problem. And I'll let you go ahead and read through this technique that you can use to take pronunciation points and build up to a listening exercise. You want to give precise and varied feedback. So instead of just telling people that they're wrong, which isn't very useful, it's a good idea to identify where exactly the error is occurring, and then extend that into some kind of exercise. So in this example, for a little small Chinese app that I'm working on, you can actually click on the character if you're having a pronunciation problem with it, and then practice it in different contexts so that you're really getting the specific sound. It has to be precise. If it's not, just telling them that it's wrong is not going to help. Vary your exercises. Here's an example of alternating between listening for detail, where you're listening for one word, and listening for gist, where you're listening to the overall context of the conversation. I haven't seen a lot of alternation between this and apps. It's kind of a problem because if you're focusing on details too much, you can't get the general meaning of what someone is saying. Varied exercises are quite important. We'll look at one with reading. So one of the difficulties with reading something like Chinese characters is that different typefaces make it look really different. So if you're looking at the same character side by side, it's like, oh, that's pretty simple. But if you look at the one on the left, and let's say you see that like 150 times, then when you go to the second one, it's going to be like, what? What just happened? So even small variation is really important. And so we have other examples. And I'll have to go through these quickly because we're pretty much out of time. That's actually Japanese. That's in Taiwan. But to be honest, I can't really read that one because of the neon lights. More variation. You want to alternate between inductive and deductive teaching. What does this mean? Very quickly, inductive teaching is when you make the student spot the pattern. So I'll let you read through this because, again, we're kind of short on time. But they have to identify the pattern themselves. Deductive teaching is when you give them the rule and you ask them to apply it. Alternating between these two things rather than picking one is the best way to get them to really internalize the rules of the language. You want to link language and culture. This is from Russian Q&A, one of the projects that I shared with you. So users actually get to slowly learn new vocabulary through reading and also learn about a real place like in Moscow at the same time. These are some questions that you can consider when you're trying to think about what content that you want to put in your app to help people understand different things about whatever culture that you're presenting. You can also use basic user information to personalize content. So if I'm trying to teach the Russian Cyrillic alphabet, I might take into consideration that someone is a native English speaker, and then I'm going to teach them the letters that are closest to the letters of their alphabet. Then I'm going to teach the ones that are kind of confusing, like the capital B in the first row is actually V. It's pronounced like a V, which is very confusing for native English speakers. And then you pick the ones that are completely different rather than just going through it in order. So, I know this was kind of fast. A lot of these teaching techniques, they took me a very long time to learn, so this is not something that in a 20-minute talk it's just going to completely transform the way you approach language apps, but I hope that it at least gives you a different perspective on some of the different techniques that you can be using in your apps. And if you have any questions, feel free to come talk to me during office hours. I'll be happy to share more in-depth resources with you or actually teach you some of these techniques. And other than that, I've really enjoyed the conference, and thank you very much for listening.